Three generations of the Scott family played important roles in North Carolina state government. Longtime News and Observer political columnist Rob Christensen tells their story in the book The Rise and Fall of the Branchhead Boys. He recently shared highlights from the book for the John Locke Foundation's Shaftesbury Society and joins us now to discuss key ideas from that presentation. Welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
Glad to be here, Mitch.
So, first of all, before we get into the Scott family, let's talk about that title. Who were the Branchhead Boys?
So, Carr Scott, who was elected governor in 1948, was an insurgent candidate. The Democratic machine had been running things, and they would name governors who's going to be governor in 4 years, and 8 years, and 12 years, and so forth. And so Carr Scott ran against the machine, which meant that when he went into a county to campaign, he really couldn't get many votes out of the courthouse crowd. He couldn't get from the judges and the clerks of courts and the sheriff, who were essentially the Democratic establishment in each county. So he would do is he would hit the most rural areas, the head of the creeks, or as he said, at the head of the branches. And so by the time he got to the courthouse, it didn't matter that the lawyers and the judges and the sheriff weren't supporting him, because he had all the support he needed in that county from the rural people. And he called them Branchhead Boys because they were the people who lived at the head of the branch or the head of the creek.
And your book talks about the Scott family and also, as the title suggests, a rise and a fall of the Branchhead Boys. We're going to get into their rise and fall, but let's turn back now to the Scotts. You mentioned Carr Scott, the patriarch of the family. This family ended up having an important role in North Carolina politics for several generations.
It did. So, there's a lot of states that have a family that's more important than others. So you think about the Byrds of Virginia, the Talmadges of Georgia, the Longs of Louisiana, the Bushes of Texas, so forth, Kennedys of Massachusetts. And that family is the Scott family in North Carolina. And it's several generations. So Carr Scott's daddy, Robert Scott, everyone called him Farmer Bob, was influential legislator in helping create NC State and so forth. Carr Scott was himself elected Agriculture Commissioner 36 and Governor 48 and United States Senate 54. His brother Ralph Scott was one of the more influential legislators of the 20th century. His son Bob Scott was elected Lieutenant Governor 64 and Governor 68 and head of the community college system. His daughter-in-law, Jessie Ray Scott, ran for Labor Commissioner, and his granddaughter, Meg Scott, was elected Agriculture Commissioner, which is in 2000, which is a whole other story.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in just a bit, which ties into the fall. But why do you think it was that this particular family ended up becoming so influential?
So it's really hard to imagine in today's age of selfies and sushi and Starbucks, what North Carolina life was like back in mid-20th century, particularly in the 30s, 1940s, and even into the 1950s. This was overwhelmingly a rural state, rural and small town. 2/3 of the people lived in what the Census Bureau said was defined as rural areas. And while life was pretty good in the towns and cities where you had all the modern amenities, that was not the case in rural North Carolina. So it was one among the last places in the country to get their roads paved, to get electric power run out to the farms, to get telephone service out in the farms. And one of the things I talk about in this book is the difficulty of life. We forget how remote and difficult rural life was without all these modern amenities. It was not only just inconvenience, it was often a matter of life and death, whether you could get to the doctor or get to the hospital in time and that sort of thing. And so the Scotts, they lived in a fairly modest farmhouse in the middle of the state. He was a dairy farmer all his life, really never left Alamance County. Even when he was governor, he would go back every weekend to the farm. When he was a senator, he would come back quite often. So he farmed that in his entire life. So it was a very modest family, but he was able to plug into a real need. He didn't have to do a poll or a focus group to find out what rural people in North Carolina needed. They needed some progress. Their lives. We talk today about how different the lives are between urban and rural people, but the contrast was even more stark back then. and he understood the needs, and the voters were willing to elect him.
We're chatting with Rob Christensen, the author of The Rise and Fall of the Branchhead Boys, a story of the Scott family and its influence on North Carolina politics. You have alluded to this already, but basically it sounds like this message was a combination of populism, but also what we would describe today as progressivism,
Yes,
putting those
that's
two
true.
things together. It seems as if that ended up being very appealing to several generations of North Carolinians.
It did, but that changed. So one of the things I did is I spent months and months going through the letters of Governor Carr Scott, who was elected in 1948, and the letters of his son, Bob Scott, when he was elected governor in 1968. And the tenor of the letters between the father and the son, 20-year difference, was just startling. The tenor of the letters for the Governor Carr Scott, like 1948, were, we want an activist government to help improve the lives of rural people, whether it's more roads or pressuring the power companies or building schools. By 1968, when Bob Scott, his son, was elected governor, it was a 180-degree turn. The message was from letter after letter was, we want the government out of our affairs, the government off our back. Now, what happened in between those 20 years? Well, several things happened. Among other things, school integration happened. It was occurring when Bob Scott was elected governor, integration in a major way, and that was a very difficult time for a lot of people of both races. There was the campus unrest, which caused a lot of people to become much more conservative. Here's an anecdote that startled me, that that in the year 1969, which was the first year that Governor Bob Scott was governor, he called out the National Guard for civil unrest 9 times in the first 6 weeks. Now, Mitch, you and I have been around this town for a while. When was the last time a governor called out the National Guard for civil unrest? He called it out 9 times in 6 months. Plus, there were other factors going on. So, the farming had changed. So, when Carr Scott was elected, there were roughly 300,000 farms in North Carolina. Today, there's fewer than 50,000. So, and the kind of farms, today there's small businesses with computers and everything. Back then, they were often tenant farms or small, struggling farmers. So the nature of farming changed. And the state became wealthier. And so as the state became wealthier, it was a pretty poor state in the mid-20th century. As it moved into later years, the income was rising and people felt less need for government. Other factors too, but those are several.
In the brief time that we have left, then the third generation, Meg Scott Phipps, gets elected to be the agriculture commissioner, but had a fall from grace because of some electoral related things.
So Meg Scott Phipps got elected agriculture commissioner in the year 2000, and she ended up going to prison for campaign finance irregularities. And the basic problem there was she hadn't got the message that when her father and her grandfather were coming along, there were a few campaign laws on the books. So these were the ages of the brown paper bag and cash being changed hands and a lot of self-serving stuff going on. And she hadn't really been understood that these changes had taken place. Plus, it used to be the agriculture commissioner was elected if all you needed to do was be in good standing with the Democratic power brokers. But by 2000 you had a two-party system, and you had to raise $1 million. And who do you raise $1 million from? Well, after you go to your Uncle Ed and your Aunt Sally, you mainly go to people who are regulated by the Department of Agriculture. And they, in turn, are often people like the Carney people in the state fair. And, of course, Carney people didn't always have the best reputation, as you might have heard, Mitch. And they also deal in a lot of cash. Trouble there, right? And so she ended up essentially taking illegal campaign contributions, not to enrich herself, but to help pay for her campaign debts.